justice, Christ who loves me so. Face to face I shall behold him, far beyond the starry sky. Face to face in all his glory, I shall see him by and by. Thank you. You may be seated. Sounded pretty good if you didn't know that one, so it sounded all right. But great words to that song as we're thinking about seeing our Lord again face to face. Our scripture reading today is taken from Matthew chapter 24. Still continuing in as we're talking about what Jesus said about the end times there. So Matthew chapter 24, and that's on page 982 in your pew Bible there, if you'd like to follow along. And we'll be starting in verse 15. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the roof of his house go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to his cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath. For then shall be a great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. At that time, if anyone says to you, "Look, here is the Christ," or "There he is," do not believe it, for false Christs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and miracles to deceive even the elect, if that were possible. See, I have told you ahead of time. So if anyone tells you, "There he is, out in the desert," do not go out, or "Here he is, in the inner rooms," do not believe it. Whereas lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather. May the Lord add his blessing to the reading of his word today. How many of you here today are Millerites? Anyone? Millerites? Now, see, I have to make a disclaimer here since we're close to Milwaukee. I'm not talking about people who like to drink Miller. Right? Millerites. It's an actual movement, a Christian movement that started back in the day, and it started by a man named Captain Miller. And Miller was a man who was serving in the War of 1812. And some of you history students may remember that. It was actually called the Second War for American Independence. And there was some crazy things that happened, like Washington, D.C. was burned. Different things like that. Well, Miller was a captain in the Army then, and he served up near the Great Lakes there, where the Canadians were actually invading the United States. And we had a battle up there on the lake and won a victory. And, he was pretty excited about it. And then, for some unknown reason, the American general decided that we should just all leave that area. And he was very upset about that, and he began to think about it. And he said, the only reason I can figure this out is that God wanted it to happen. So that drove him to start thinking more about God. And before that, he wasn't really too into God. So he started reading the Bible a lot and started going to church, and he became a Baptist, and started learning all these things. And as he was reading, he became more and more convinced that the end was coming. And so he got a lot of people that were interested in this too, as he was talking about the Lord's return. And he talked about it over and over. He had these big tent meetings, and lots of people came. But then he decided, along with one of his followers, they decided as they were reading Daniel, that they could actually put a date on when Jesus was coming back. And so they said, on October 22nd, 1844, Jesus is returning. His followers believed it so much that they all quit their jobs. They left everything they had, and they went out there to wait for that day. What happened? Well, you know what it was called by his followers? It was called the Great Disappointment. And what a sad thing to think about in your religious experience, to have a great disappointment fit in there, right? So they were disappointed because the Lord didn't come and they had expected it. And some of them went off and said, well, this is just foolish, I'm not going to believe it. Some of them thought, well, maybe there is something to this. Maybe he was right, but we just didn't know it. And so they took that parable. Remember, those of you who were here last week, you remember that we did the parable of the 10 virgins, right? The wise and the foolish, right? So hopefully you can remember that. I know as we get older, our memory's not so good, but we remember that. But he took that parable and said, well, maybe what that means is the wise people were the ones who were ready in 1844 for the return of Christ, and the foolish ones weren't. So in other words, if you knew God before 1844, then you could be saved, but afterwards it was too late, because just like in the parable, the door was shut. So now we have a weird theology going on where he's starting to say these people can't be saved anymore. And some people believed it and some people didn't. And there were a lot of splinter groups that broke off of his, including some groups that we might today consider to be cults that started as they were thinking this thing through. My point today is to let you know a little obscure fact from religious history, but also to have us say, sometimes theology does matter. Because we do things and we believe things, and it causes us to do things that, we do it based on what we believe is right. And some people go too far and end up doing the wrong thing because they misinterpreted. So how do we interpret these passages today about what Jesus said was coming? Well, first here he talks about the abomination of desolation, and that's kind of a confusing terminology for us to wrap our mind around. The word abomination just means something that's impure or detested or idolatry. And so the idea behind that is it's something really horrible that God detests. In the Old Testament, there are 100 occurrences of this word, abomination. But we think that it's referring specifically to something that breaks the covenant of God. Now, in Daniel, it talks about this as well, and Jesus is referring back to that. In Daniel 12, it says, from the time that the daily sacrifice is abolished and the abomination that causes desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. And that's one prophecy. There's another prophecy about it also in Daniel 9, 26 and 27, which I'm not going to get into today. And so Jesus is saying, you've read the prophet Daniel, this is going to happen. Now, those people who interpret Daniel also think that this happened once before when the Greeks came and they set up in the temple, they set up the altar of Zeus and sacrificed a pig on the altar. So that was a pretty detestable thing. But also Jesus is predicting that it's going to happen again. And this is an interesting thing in prophecy that a lot of times you see more than one fulfillment of a prophecy where it happens multiple times. And in this case, it happens again too. Jesus is referring to what's going to happen shortly after he dies. Now, I don't know how many of you know your kind of religious history here, but what happened after Jesus died, 40 years later, Jerusalem was destroyed. And as you remembered, when we set this section up, Jesus was talking to his disciples. And he said to them, not one stone of this temple is going to stand. They're all standing there before the temple and saying, hey, look how great our temple is. And he says, none of this is going to stand. It's all going to fall. And they're looking at him like, what are you talking about? And the people of his day didn't understand what he was talking about. But one of those things I think that happened is that this is part of the punishment for rejecting Christ. And that the city that they loved would fall to the Romans. Now, we don't always understand why this would happen because we don't live in those times. This is where I think, understanding the culture and the history of the Jewish people is important in understanding what is said here. When we look at what happened to Jesus, why was he crucified? There's a lot of things that we don't understand that was going on there. And part of that had to do with what was going on between Rome and the Jewish people. One of the problems with the Roman rule is they taxed very severely. Some of us from our history remember, why did we break away from Great Britain? What was the big issue? Well, yeah, but they taxed it, right? We had that big slogan, no taxation without representation. Now we have lots of Congress and they still tax us, right? So Did we win? I don't know. That was a big issue. And if you read the Gospels, who is the worst person mentioned in the Gospel? Those hated tax collectors. Now, see, this was funny because in my first church, I had two really nice ladies who worked at the town tax assessors, and one Sunday they come up to me and say, "Why are you always talking bad about tax collectors?" I said, "Well, I hope you're not like the ones in the Bible, right? Because the reason they hated tax collectors was not just because they collected your tax, but also they assessed you more tax than they needed to so they could have income on their own. Rome basically said, you have a quota. You fill this much taxes, and whatever else you do, that's on you. We don't really care." And so they would go out and say, "You owe this much tax," and then they charge you double or triple in order so they could make a profit. That's why tax collectors were hated. So that was one big issue. The second issue they had was with religion. The Romans believed in many gods. They were polytheistic. What about the Jewish God? Did it believe in many gods? What does it say in the Bible? What is one of the 10 Commandments? Thou shalt have no other gods before me. You see how this could be a conflict here. Because the Romans actually in some ways, they didn't care as much, because if you believed in a lot of gods, you can always add a +1, right? If you say, well, there's all these different gods, well, you believe in a Jewish God? Okay, we'll just add him. He's a God you can worship too. No worries. And so in some ways it was kind of liberal in that thinking, in that, we're just adding an extra God. And I think missionaries have trouble with this too, because the missionaries to India, right? They talk about Jesus and accepting him. They're like, sure, we'll do that. But they're not necessarily saying we accept Jesus alone. They're just saying we'll add him to all these other gods we worship, right? And so they had that kind of idea. But when the Jewish people talked about faith and their temple and that, they only wanted to worship the one true God. And so sometimes there was a big conflict between that. And you see, part of what happened in the crucifixion there was this was in play. In the Roman mind, they're worried about rebellion. And the Jewish mind, they're worried about, they don't think Jesus is religious, correct religiously. But the Romans didn't care at all whether the Jewish people had some kind of Messiah. That made no difference to them. What did they care about? It's kind of answered on what they wrote on Jesus' cross. What did it say on Jesus' cross? Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. See, that's what Romans cared about. They cared that they were saying, this is a political guy who wants to be king. That's why we're crucifying him. And so there's this whole set of issues going on. And if you read the Gospels, one of the reasons it tells us that the chief priests were upset with Jesus is they said, if we allow this man to continue, the Romans are going to come down on us. They're going to take our religious freedom away, because they're going to say this guy's, bucking the system. He's against what we're talking about and the freedom that we have. And so there's this whole political thing in play. After Jesus died, after he was resurrected, 40 years later, there was a big rebellion. Right? The Romans were trying to do things the Jewish people didn't like. They threw them out. They got rid of the Romans, and the Romans sent an army to destroy them. And they did. And this is what Jesus is predicting here in this prophecy. And the problem that we have with prophecy is that we're very thinking of it like a newscast. And a lot of times in a prophecy, what happens is they talk about 2 or 3 different events that may actually be separated by hundreds of years before they occur. And we don't always know when we're talking about. And part of what's going on in this prophecy here, he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, which happens only 40 years after he says it. And then he's also talking about the end times. The challenge for us as Christians is to figure out which he's referring to at what time. And so we're reading the passage and we're saying, well, yeah, okay, some of this refers to what happened in Jerusalem. As we're reading that kind of dramatic part about, don't run out and find your cloak. Just run, just flee. He's referring to Judea. And when the Romans attack, just get out of there, is what he's saying, because you won't have a chance to get away. So it was a warning for them specifically in that day. But also, now it also talks to us a little bit more. When he talks about having such a great distress that has never happened in the world and will never happen since. Now, he could be referring to that time in Israel. The